So yes, as you can see from the slide, I'm here representing Europeana. My name is Tim Hill. I'm actually the search engineer with Europeana. So everything is being focalized a little bit through the search engineer lens. That being said, the way we're using connected data now, that's a pretty good lens to focalize through, as will become clear as we go along. I would venture to say that a lot of people here are not too familiar with Europeana and what we do. We are a large organization, mostly funded by the EU. And our mission statement is transforming the world with culture, which is actually slightly misleadingly truncated. Really what we're trying to do is to help other people reuse cultural assets from across Europe in making their own cultural contributions. So the idea is that our users will be transforming the world with culture, not that we do it ourselves. So what we are really is an aggregator. We get information, metadata from cultural heritage institutions across Europe, not just EU countries. We've got stuff from everywhere from Ireland to Armenia. And then because of the colonial history of most of the European powers, of course, we also have a lot of artifacts and a lot of information about things from past European borders as well. So we have a lot of Japanese holdings, a lot of Indian holdings, and so on and so forth. So we're a very large cultural heritage aggregator. In most cases, all we're harvesting is metadata. So we're harvesting the information that various cultural heritage institutions hold about the artifacts. We make that available and we publish it through our portal site. And the idea normally is that people are going to click on a link and go back to the originating institution. So we're really a discoverability service. You can find out what's in European cultural heritage organizations through us. We're not a provider of our own data. That being said, that's been shifting a little bit. We are incorporating more and more content. So for instance, we'll be holding a lot of European newspapers, and you'll be able to actually read the issue online through the Europeana portal. Some 3D models are more readily hosted by us than by their host institutions. So we do have some content of our own, but mostly we're an aggregator and discoverability service. And I should also make clear that our mission is very open. It's very much about making sure that this is available to people to reuse. So all of our metadata is CC0, and as far as possible, the content that we host is also reusable freely by people. That's not always the case, but it's certainly part of our mission and something that we aim to increase over time. In terms of numbers, we've got about 53 million items. That keeps on going up. We keep on getting more and more as digitization progresses. We've got something like 30 languages, a little bit more. We officially, of course, support the official EU languages, of which there's 28, but then there's an awful lot of languages that are held that are non-European languages. There's all sorts of weird stuff in there. I had no idea there were so many artificial languages in the world. Esperanto is like the most successful of a whole family of artificial languages, and we've got representations of that in there. So linguistics is a huge difficulty for us. We've got multilingual representation is just a continual challenge that we're always facing. And we're aggregating right now actually something more like 3,500 galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. Although again, that number keeps on going up with time. The shape of our data is very strange. I suspect it's probably unique amongst the people who have presented here today. In terms of volume, it's not huge by anyone's standards. Once we've got everything in our Solar data store, which is what we use for retrieval, it's a little bit under 2 terabytes. It's certainly quite readily handleable. There's nothing to worry about there. Velocity of the data is not high. We do have a kind of continuous publishing framework because institutions are continually updating their records. They're continually changing how they feel about their records, what they want to record about their records. So we are updating quite a bit. But in fact, none of this is tremendously time sensitive. So we're flushing to our data store every 15 minutes. So people write and it gets stored in a buffer and then we just flush it out. Um, and a lot of the reason for that kind of continuous updating is the veracity problem. We've got huge problems of data quality and reliability. Maybe not in the sense of information being wrong necessarily, but being in a format that is not tremendously useful, of not being available in the languages that it ought to be available in, of it not being normalized with other kinds of data. So that work goes on continually. But the big V for us is variety. It's an incredibly messy domain. If you think about galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, they are doing very different things in a lot of ways. It all falls under the culture umbrella, but a library, for instance, deals with lots and lots and lots of copies of one notional item. Archives and galleries are often dealing with unique items about which they want to record very particular kinds of information. How a curator describes a painting is going to be very different from how they describe a sculpture, and it's going to differ depending on the era that the sculpture is from or the painting is from, and so on and so forth. So our data is extremely heterogeneous. It is a huge, messy bag of stuff. So given that we have a huge, messy bag of stuff that we're giving to the public, what are people actually looking for? Why are people coming to our big, messy data store? They fall into two camps broadly. I think most of our use, most of our traffic comes from people called culture vultures. This particular split here between culture vultures and culture snackers, I don't know if it's the happiest phraseology you could use, but it's very widely used in the cultural heritage sector. And it's cleaving between people who are very, very seriously engaged in cultural heritage stuff and people who are really browsing. Academic researchers are a big user base for us, people working in universities typically. Teachers and students, not down at the elementary level so much, but once you get to high school, once you get to students maybe 12 and up. And at the university level, you'll get teachers and students using our stuff. And then we've got a user base of visual artists because we have an awful lot of paintings and an awful lot of posters and graphic design works. We get a fair number of people working in visual media who come to us looking for archives of old material. And then we have a fairly large number of people who are amateurs in the sense that they're not paid for this stuff, but they take it very seriously, and they're often at least as well informed as professionals are about the domain that they've chosen to focus on. So amateur genealogists are often on our site. And then military history buffs are often extremely well informed and are browsing around Europeana for stuff. And then, so that's one sort of big category of people who have got broadly similar expectations of our platform. And then there's people who just kind of browse through and are just kind of looking around for stuff that they find interesting for the moment. The problem that this creates is that we have got an incredibly varied array of user demands, and they've got almost nothing in common with each other. So as a search engineer, part of my job is to just go through our logs and look what people are looking for. And what you really want to see if you're going to engineer this stuff in a statistical way is a nice big bump somewhere in your graph saying, oh, people are looking for this, give them that. I've been looking at our logs for the last 6 months, and there's no search term used by any more than 6 users. And even that is kind of rare. Mozart, I think, is our most common query, and that 6 people asked for Mozart. So we don't really have like a long tail. We're more like a snake. Like it's completely flat. Everybody wants something different. And part of that is because we've got a diverse user base, and part of that is actually because of the way researchers and artists use web search is a little bit unusual in that they're often using us because they've hit a dead end. They feel like they know everything of the material they've got. They know it very well and they've mastered it. They're looking for something that they don't already know. They're looking for an unknown unknown, what gets called in the trade serendipity search. So they're hoping to find this weird thing that opens a door for them. And that leads to very weird query patterns. That leads to people who are sort of essentially trying to surprise themselves. So it's a hard demand to satisfy. Once they do find something, they love us. It's great. People who Search our site are typically extremely engaged. Another sort of truism of search engineering, and anyone can think about this intuitively, nobody ever looks past the first page of hits, right? I mean, if you're past like the top 3 items in Google, you're kind of off the bottom of the page. Our mean rank for a clicked item is number 82. That means people have gone at least 8 pages in to find an item and start looking at it, and then they will spend the rest of the day there. We've got sessions that go on for hours and hours and hours of people clicking and looking at stuff. So it's very much about depth more than about traversal. The flip side of that is that our culture snackers tend to bounce off pretty quickly. They find something, they look at it, they say, what's that? Oh, okay, whatever, and then they leave. So we've got very diverse patterns of usage there. If they do find stuff and they do find it interesting, it's typically because they want to make something new. They're not just looking for information or to improve their knowledge about something. They will typically be recording it in some way. So producing essays, producing research reports, creating presentations is surprisingly frequent, or new artworks or something like that. So it's a generative kind of website. Connected data has always been quite central to the vision of what Europeana is about. And part of that, as I alluded to in the panel, is because the library space has been always very friendly to connected data, to linked data, to going back all the way to the semantic web. Because it's a problem that the cultural heritage sector tends to run into fairly quickly, is one of interlinkage. You often have experts who are working in a small domain. It's a domain that maybe has 10 or 20 other experts alive in it, and maybe 100 experts who have worked on it at all, who have got very intense curatorial models and very deep data modeling that they want to do. Whether they think of it as data modeling is another question, but they've typically got a very rich and fine-grained understanding of the domain that they're working in. So linked data has been quite important in these particular groups of people, and they're willing to go to a lot of trouble to link their data to other data sets. So Europeana has always been quite keen on linked data, connected data in the various forms that it's taken. I'm sure this diagram is familiar to most of you. This is the linked open data cloud, I think from 2011. And Europeana's original idea was we're just going to be part of this cloud, right? We're going to publish our data in a linkable format, and people can hook into that and combine it however they want, and they'll use it like that. So it's in a sense a sort of passive vision of linked data. Our users are going to do the work. We're not going to have to do too much to facilitate that. This continues to be part of our mandate, part of our mission. I think it's fair to say that the idea that we were just going to put linked data out there and it would be tremendously picked up on and used in kind of raw RDF form, it does happen. We have a Sparkle endpoint. People do use it. It's probably not the most crucial or most fundamental way people are using our platform. What the kind of linked data way of thinking about things really got us in the long term, first of all, it got us ontological modeling. Because we're dealing with very rich domains, data mediation has been a huge issue for Europeana. And being able to think in terms of RDF and being able to write an RDF specification of what data should look like has been hugely valuable to Europeana. And it's expressed in something called the Europeana data model, which is what we share with our data partners, the different institutions. We express it in RDF. It's used by various institutions around the world, at least in part. So the Digital Public Library of America has been very influenced by EDM and sort of has EDM at its kernel for its data model. The BBC has used EDM to some extent. There's digital national library initiatives in Australia, New Zealand, to some extent in Canada that have intersected with the EDM. So the data model has been very valuable to us. As I say, we make it available on our Sparkle endpoint, which does get some traffic. But more frequently, we're giving this to people over our API. People are querying using our search and record APIs and getting back linked data that way. And that seems to have been successful insofar as we did get an award for it this year. People like the search API that we've got, and they like getting linked data over it. So it's working well that way. However, I think our perspective on linked open data has changed in the last 3 or 4 years and shifted quite a bit from thinking of ourselves mostly as providers of linked data, as people who are going to make it available to the wider public, to actually benefiting from harvesting linked open data into our data stores. Because the main problem that we've got as a platform is that we've got a messy domain, an unstructured domain, a domain that to a large extent, a lot of its value is in the fact that it's a bit messy and unpredictable. And then we've got users who are doing unpredictable things. So what we need is some kind of coherent way of structuring stuff. It's hard to find stuff. We don't want people necessarily going to rank 82. We want to retain more culture snackers. So what we're doing is we're entitifying, we're strings to thinging a lot of our records, because most of our searches are for named entities. They'll typically be for artist names or for places. People use concepts a lot, or subject headings is one way to think about that in the library world. And so why not be able to create a kind of controlled vocabulary based on URIs for that? And we've been able to harvest information from a variety of sources. DBpedia has been helpful. Wikidata has been very helpful. GeoNames. We use SCOS for the concepts. One particular aspect of that that's very important for us is something called workification, which is probably doesn't have a lot of analogies outside the GLAM world, where it's this idea that you've got a sort of abstract intellectual or artistic or creative work of which your data records are only instantiations. So if you've got a novel like Oliver Twist, there's this idea that there is a novel called Oliver Twist that floats out there somewhere, but that what we're talking about is particular editions or translations of it. Equally for painting, something like the Mona Lisa is abstract. Then there's the canvas painted by Leonardo da Vinci, and then there's the copies of it, or the studies of it, or the other works that it's influenced, which are kind of instantiations of those works. So that's one particular kind of entity we're very keen to abstract out of the records we've got. And we can use OCLC and VF for that kind of work. And then finally, what we'd really like to do is link this together into a knowledge graph. So find connections between the various entities that we've pulled out using NER. This has got a lot of obvious applications. It's great for educational stuff in particular, that if you look up Leonardo da Vinci and you're a first-time user, you might not know very much about him as an artist, what he's done. He's a very diverse kind of creator. And so being able to find links between him and the works that he created, other artists he knew, places he was connected with, patrons and that kind of thing would be very useful for education and research purposes. It would certainly improve engagement of people who just came by looking for, I don't know, the Mona Lisa or something famous. They could move deeply more easily. And then it would be nice for that kind of serendipity search. Surprising yourself is kind of a hard thing to do. Links make that a lot easier because we provide them rather than the user. So those would be the benefits of a knowledge graph for us. And I started playing around with knowledge graph creation a little bit last year during a hack week, and I was really happy because one of the things that I found messing around with data sets from the Rijksmuseum was I was trying to create a social network. And I found this weird link between Rembrandt and the 6th Mughal emperor of India, and I was like, this is kind of weird. I thought there was a lot of noise in the data, but then what I discovered was actually that Rembrandt had created a bunch of depictions of the Indian royal family in the 17th century, which he got from miniatures that had been shipped from India. And he was just fascinated by India, and he went through this whole phase of creating these private little artworks for himself. And I thought, oh, that's pretty cool, actually. But it was just a little pilot, so I couldn't really do anything with it. I just thought it was a little nugget to tuck away at the back of my head. But I just read 2 weeks ago that there's a big exhibition opening in India right now talking about the connections between India and Europe during precisely this age. And this connection is precisely the centerpiece of it. And I was like, oh, okay. So I did find something that cultural heritage professionals think is interesting. It's not just me who found this weird little thing. It's that this is, a culturally significant thing. So it is possible, using automated techniques, to flush out these kinds of relationships. Our technical stack, the way we do this, is not particularly interesting. So I'll just whip through this. This will be like bog standard for anybody who's ever done any development work. We suck in data using Java and XSLT, which it's because we're sucking in RDF XML. We do the named entity recognition using some Java libraries. Everything goes into MongoDB because it's a very messy kind of data store where you can say stuff fairly easily and messily. That gets remediated into Solr and Neo4j for retrieval purposes. API is done in Java again. We've got a UI with a bunch of glitzy JavaScript stuff going on. And the Sparkle endpoint is virtuoso. Like, there's nothing there that would make a developer feel particularly challenged, I think. So it's technically, you know, it's not simple, it's hard to maintain, but it's nothing whizzy. How far are we actually towards creating this knowledge graph and using linked data in this way? The problem we've got is basically dirty data. The problem is nothing particularly technical, it's just that our data is a mess, and a lot of it's to do with the fact that we're in a messy domain. Named entity recognition does not work very well for us because we're dealing with so many languages, and we're dealing with a small domain of artists. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands probably, but in a lot of cases, it's a historical domain, so the number of variants is huge. It's kind of nice working with NER stuff because typically people have fewer names than there are languages. So Rembrandt van Rijn is Rembrandt van Rijn in most Latin-based European languages. But even so, it's not easy to develop good heuristics for string matching. So we're really just doing exact string matching right now, which has got huge limitations. So even though our highest quality data sets are readily surfaced and readily entitified, our recall is very, very poor right now. So it's really just small islands in our data store that are NER'd very well. And we're not really helped that much right now by the connected data stack. We don't have a lot of good ways of cleaning, enhancing, validating our data. OpenRefine is potentially helpful, but we prefer not to do too much data cleaning in-house manually, particularly because we are an aggregator. We don't want to be telling the Rijksmuseum, the National Museum of the Netherlands, how to spell Dutch names. We want them to be able to do that. Validation technologies that we could apply in-house, like Shex and Shackle, they look good, they're very promising, and they've got good people working on them. They're not mature in the sense that we can just pick them up and start using them tomorrow, which is really where we'd like them to be. Then there's dirty data in the linked data resources themselves. And again, this is really because of our messy domain. We're pulling an awful lot of information out of Wikidata and DBpedia. And of course, you can say whatever you like within those particular data stores. So you often don't know what kind of information you can retrieve. So for instance, when I was working on Dutch artists during the Hack Week, I couldn't really rely upon particular fields being filled in. Other times you could find amazing data, like in Wikidata I found a property was killed in revenge by, and I thought that's great. That's really interesting, but you can't rely upon that information being there, so querying becomes kind of this weird art form, and it's very hard to do it reliably. We have problems of incorrect data, typically not that there's a string that's wrong, which would be great because that would be easy to fix. It's more often problems of structure. So you'll get, in both Wikidata, but in particular GeoNames, you'll get these hierarchies that cycle and can kind of bring down your entire programming stack if you're not careful. You can make tremendously wrong inferences and tremendously wrong connections because of, a single mistyped property. And then we've often got a problem of data which is uncurated or aggregated in turn that we have to filter pretty extensively. So VIAF, the Virtual International Authority file, is great in that it gives us the authoritative records for author names. But all it does is it sucks them in from libraries all over the world. So like George Bernard Shaw has got like 64 variants or something, which is not particularly helpful for us because we have to choose one. And so that becomes a largely kind of manual process and very time-intensive process. So in terms of how we're going to be going forward with this, we have to resign ourselves to the fact that a lot of this work is going to be manual, or a lot of it's going to be heavily supervised, that things like machine learning approaches or heuristic algorithms being applied are going to have to be heavily, heavily supervised and sanity checked an awful lot by a human who knows what they're doing. Reconciliation in this sector is a big issue because a lot of the time people are using internal identifiers in a very consistent way, but they don't tell us what they relate to. There's a couple of American groups right now who are working on creating a kind of interlibrary reconciliation service so that we could aggregate nicely and have authorities that we could consult in order to skip the NER step entirely, just have canonical references, which would be great. And then the rest of it is really trying to get our partners to do more. So saying to them, here are some tools we can give you to clean up your data as you see appropriate before you give it to us, and then we can do more with it. And then, of course, beyond that, there's the question of crowdsourcing. We have an annotations API recently in place, which essentially allows people to make connected data assertions about entities in our data stores. And so we're hoping that once that gets off the ground, given that we've got a very strong expert user base, we can grow our knowledge quite quickly and reliably. And that is about it, because that's kind of the optimistic direction forward is let other people do the work, and we're going to see how that goes in the coming 12, 18 months, I think. Thank you.
Maybe if I could ask the panelists to get set up on the panel, and in the meantime, we've got time for some questions for Tim. Are there any questions from this side of the room? You have a question?
I have a comment. So, actually, the co-editor of Jekyll, Dimitris Kontokostas, he also made this tool RDF unit, and he made it in a way that works fully automatic. So, actually, you should just throw the data into it, and it should produce these test results and errors.
Okay.
People are more complaining that you cannot configure it fine-grained enough because it works fully automatic, kind of like. So that's just as a comment. The other thing is what you had a slide about the plug.
Oh yeah, plug. That was just me bigging us up. Yes.
Yeah, but what is it? What is the plug? What is? I couldn't Google it, so I don't know.
Oh, sorry, that was just very idiomatic English. So a plug is like a promotion that you do. Like I'm plugging something, so I was just saying this is me plugging myself. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's really not a question, it was more of a comment and observation, especially when you were talking about the interesting stuff that you actually discover when you're querying this, because I think this is absolutely awesome. I was just wondering if you've come across things, for example, like searching for a certain painting or an artifact, and then you come up with that, okay, it's being exhibited somewhere in a certain museum, but at the same time you get it that it's archived in another museum. And it's kind of interesting to see how fake artifacts are actually going around. So I saw that as a really cool kind of finding from this integrated data that you're putting up here. So it was just like an observation, really.
Oh yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, we do have a little bit of a problem with the fine-grainedness of how much we can assert about institutions right now. Actually, provenance is a real problem for us. Not so much that we don't record it well, but people always want to know more. So yeah, that's certainly an area we'd like to expand EDM into representing better.
Okay, well, thanks a lot to Tim.